The title of the talk is Super Patriotism, Real Patriotism, and the Importance of Being Number One. Well, as a guest on radio talk shows, I have on a number of occasions criticized U.S. foreign policy, and one time an irate caller called in and he said to me, do you love your country? And the question was obviously rhetorical, because here was someone who saw fit to question my patriotism because I was questioning the policies of our leaders. It's really strange when you think about it. The caller was manifesting a symptom of what might be called super patriotism, also sometimes called stupor patriotism, also called pseudo-patriotism, a phenomenon best defined as the willingness to follow our leaders uncritically in all their dealings with other nations, especially when those dealings are confrontational and belligerent and they involve a question of national pride or the use of military force. That's the definition of super-patriotism. This super-patriotism or American chauvinism has been with us throughout much of our history. And whether or not it's the last refuge of scoundrels, as Dr. Johnson would say, it certainly is a very effective instrument in discouraging and discrediting critical public discourse. Well, I think it's time that the super patriots account for their brand of patriotism and explain to us what it's all about. For instance, what do they mean when they say they love their country? What do they mean by country? You know, academia is not totally without certain virtues. You learn to ask a lot of trivial, detailed questions in any case. So I asked myself, what do you mean by country? Do they love every region and locale in the United States? Well, obviously, very few of us have been to every region and locale, and nor would all of us find all the regions and locales all that lovable. Does love of country mean loving the American people? Well, again, even the most gregarious among us have met only a relatively small portion of the American people. And I would bet that the super patriots don't particularly love whole sectors of the American public, especially the more bigoted super patriots. In fact, rather dislike to associate with or have any positive identification with certain people because of reasons of ethnicity, religion, race, and class. Do super patriots love America for its history and culture? Again, I'm really skeptical of that because it's my impression that they know very little about American history and culture, or rather, much of it is rather unappreciated by them. Furthermore, there's a terrible side to our history that's really not all that lovable. For instance, the extermination of Native American Indian nations, the enslavement of African people, the aggressive wars against Vietnam, Mexico, Canada. We lost 1,000 men on one attack on Canada. I just learned a little while ago. Central America, the Philippines, and elsewhere. Nor might we all be that enamored with certain aspects of American culture. Certainly not the mind abuse of primetime television, the commercialism, the corporate greed, the ecological devastation, the economic and racial injustice. If I'm being asked to prove my patriotism by loving American popular culture, then I might fail the test, I guess. Well, the America that the super patriots claim to love is neither a geographical totality, nor is it a vast population, nor is it really a history or culture. As far as I can see, their America, and they say love America, is an ideological abstraction. It's an emotive symbol that can be embodied in other abstract symbols like the flag. It's sort of almost a love without content. I mean, how else can you love a flag? I mean, a flag, as you know, is a piece of rag on a stick, and it's got colors and things. And if you love that flag, and that flag's a symbol of your country, it's a kind of love that doesn't seem to have a content to it. Well, having said that, let me contradict myself, because there is one real content to the super patriotism. Its main substance is militarism. The pacifist and political scientist and activist, by the way, good pacifists are not passive, they're pacifists, and they're quite active. The pacifist and activist, Milford Sibley, he once noted, quote, "Patriotism for most professional patriots seems to be inseparably connected with military violence, and war. Indeed, the most militaristic among us seem to think that they are the most patriotic. Isn't that rather extraordinary? Patriotic virtues are equated with military ones. Our history's patriotic vignettes are usually military ones. Valley Forge, the Alamo, Gettysburg, the battleship Maine, Pearl Harbor, raising the flag on Iwo Jima, D-Day, the MIAs and POWs, and the like. Our country, right or wrong, but mostly our country at war or ready for war. The commemorations of our national leaders during national holidays would be incomplete without the marching troops, the weapon displays, martial music, formations of fighter planes zooming overhead. Even in local communities, when they organize patriotic celebrations, the marching bands usually appear in semi-martial uniforms, the high school cadets with rifles on their shoulders, and if there's an army base nearby, even troops. I remember once sitting in Urbana, Illinois, July 4th, watching this parade come by, and on this float was suddenly this missile, sort of small missile, but there was this instrument of death on this float that was going by, and there were some people around me, and you know what they did? They started to applaud this inanimate object. I mean, there wasn't even a pilot or, somebody else tending to it, or a soldier striding it and waving and going, yow, look at me, it was too much for me. And they were just applauding this weapon. And a little jet fighter came by on the float and they started applauding that too. This was at a time when these things were being used in Vietnam. Well, even July 4th fireworks sometimes are really a benign representation or replication of the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, as the top patriotic song on our patriotic hit parade goes. Max Weber once said that the state's irreducible characteristic is a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. And to be sure, state ceremonies in most states include some display of military force. Now, the way super patriots express their national pride leaves me uncomfortable. It seems the love we are to have for our country rests on some kind of competition with other countries, that it comes at an expense with other countries. It's a love that is predicated on some invidious comparison to other countries being lesser, being not as good. If we love our country, we have to believe it's better than any other. The super patriots will even ask us, don't you think this is the best country in the world? So that you love it because it's better. It's something better. This, by the way, we might recognize immediately as the being number one syndrome. I guess I must have heard about being number one for a long time, but the first time it ever stuck in my mind was when I heard President Richard Nixon, sometime in the late 60s, announce, and I quote, "America is still number one." The still, of course, hints at some anxiety that there might be some slippage there. So I'm listening to this and I'm saying, okay, number one. Number one. That makes me feel, like number one, and that's pretty good. But I was bothered by it because it presumed that we were in some kind of adversarial relationship to other nations, all other countries, and that somehow our greatness and our goodness could only be measured in comparison to them, only in our ability to be the top banana. So I said, all right, we're number one. And then one of those troublesome questions came again in my head. And I said, if we're number one, what are we number one in? I mean, what are you number one in? So I said, population? And then, no, the Chinese walk away with all the awards in that category. Geography? No, I think the Soviets and even Canada has more real estate than we do. We're not number one in size. I think Brazil, there's a number of countries, I think. I don't even want to think about it, about all the countries that might be ahead of us there. Steel production and other basic industries? I perked up a little. Well, we used to be number one in that, but we have slipped down the list because our super patriot corporate leaders have taken to abandoning our communities and exporting our jobs and bringing the factories off to Taiwan and Argentina and South Korea, where they can work for slave labor wages. Which, when you think about it, is not the way for super patriots to act, really, take our factories away and all that. So I said, well, what are we number one? Are we number one in cuisine? Please. Please. I mean, in that category, we are strictly double digits. Way behind, France, China, Japan, Mexico, Italy, India, Greece, and others. Are we number one in trade? I know we used to be number one in trade, but I believe the Japanese have outstripped us, or so it would seem to anybody who's walked into any department store in the last couple of years. So the question remains, I was sitting there saying, well, what are we number one in? And the best I can tell from the super patriotic utterances is that it gets down to two things. One, wealth, with no concern as to how the wealth is distributed and how it's used and for what effects, and military power, with no concern again with how that military power is used and for whose interests that it might serve at home and abroad. A few years ago, President Reagan exclaimed, quote, we are proud of America. We love America. America is the greatest. Now, the greatest, and when you say America is the greatest, that's another way of saying number one. America is number one. Now, supposedly we can love America and be proud of our country because it's so great. The implication is, however, that if it weren't so great, it wouldn't be so lovable. And that began to trouble me. The super patriot's love of country seems predicated on the country's being up there, stronger and superior to other countries. What happens if it's going to slip? What happens? I started thinking, really, what about people from lesser lands, as we might call them? I mean, what about somebody from Luxembourg? I mean, now Luxembourg is number 122, I mean, just barely ahead of San Marino in its military might. I said, what does someone from Luxembourg do? They go around shamefaced like this, You say, you from Luxembourg? You from Luxembourg? I say, no, I'm French. No, I'm French. And you say, do you love your country? They say, well, what is there to love? I mean, a few border police, no army, no navy. I mean, it's The super patriots were exhilarated by the U.S. aggression perpetrated against Grenada. To them, such military exploits are an affirmation of our nation's strength and worth, and therefore their own individual strength and worth. I mean, there's people who went around who really got off on the invasion of Grenada. They said, we really kicked their ass. Whoa, like the Washington Redskins versus St. Mary's Junior High School football team. Oh, we really gave it to them. Ronald Reagan, the conqueror of Grenada, reflecting upon his greatest military victory, hailed the venture as an example of how the U.S. defends democracy. Since the U.S. has taken over in Grenada, Grenada's unemployment rate has tripled. Since it's been liberated from Moscow's yoke, Grenada's native enterprises and development projects and health and education programs that were initiated by the New Jewel movement have been abolished and been rolled back. Grenada is once more safe for private capital penetration. And the Reagan invasion served notice to the Caribbean nations they had better not try to develop alternative social orders that go against the multinational corporate way of doing things. That's what the invasion was about. And Ronald Reagan was right when he said it's not a question of nutmeg. It was not a question of direct U.S. capital investment in the country, which was small because it's only a country of 110,000 people. It was a question of serving notice to the Caribbean that you cannot be masters of your own destiny. You cannot develop your resources, your labor, your land, your capital, your technology for yourselves. You are there to be milked by us. That is, by people of Ronald Reagan's class, not by us. We got milked on that too. We paid for that expedition. We paid for that invasion. It was our sons who died in that invasion. And it was more than 18, I assure you. Questions were raised about the number of people killed. Now, most super patriots don't think about Grenada in that way. They think about it the other way. It was a real victory, as I say. But most of the world didn't see that invasion as some kind of victory. It wasn't perceived as a sign of strength by Latin America and most other nations. It was seen as a sign of weakness. It wasn't seen as a glorious thing. It was seen as a shameful thing. When the most powerful country in the world has to invade a micro state of 110,000 people and feel proud that they won, There were more citations given for heroism on Grenada than there were soldiers that went. There were literally hundreds of citations for officers, lieutenant colonels, and all that. Many of them never left the Pentagon through that whole operation, and they were all given these citations by Mr. Reagan to validate the heroism, the enormous accomplishment, the patriotism of this great venture. If anything, Grenada ought to make us wonder that maybe America isn't number one. Indeed, there's someone going around this country who's saying that. He's the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. In a speech in Chicago in March 1988, during the primary campaigns, Michael Dukakis said, quote, "We need a strategy that will make America number one." I said, make America number one? I thought it was number one. I mean, certainly since Grenada we're number one. I see that with these liberals sowing seeds of doubt in our minds. The next month in Cleveland, Michael Dukakis announced, "We're going to take charge of our economic future, and we're not going to stop until America is number one." Like all his predecessors, Dukakis doesn't explain what's so important about being number one. Well, what the hell does it mean to be number one anyway? This preoccupation with being number one strikes me, ladies and gentlemen, as I say, as a sign of weakness, not of strength. As a sign of insecurity, not of security. A people who know who they are don't worry about being number one. A people who are in touch with the deeper values of social justice and democracy don't get a number one thrill from stomping on a tiny nation. A people who seek friendship and cooperation with other peoples don't need to lord it over other nations and outshine them. Such a people don't have to find reassurances in themselves by looking at or imagining the deficiencies of others. And they don't feel threatened by the accomplishments and strengths of other people. They don't panic when they fail to win the most gold medals or most medals at the Olympics. You watch the Olympic coverage, and it's an amazing case of super patriotism. I remember the LA Olympics, the Summer Olympics. There was one swim meet I watched, and the camera was on this American swimmer the whole time. The guy came in third. And as he came in, the announcement of who won, who got the gold and silver, wasn't made by the ABC announcer. You could hear it, like in the pool. It was an off-mic announcement. I suppose you could hear it, but I didn't catch it. And they just kept saying, I forget the guy's name. "Oh, Tom feels bad about that. Yeah, let's get a replay on that last spin." And the camera followed him getting out of the water and walking along. "Yeah, it's really terrible." And I'm keep saying, who won that match? Who won it? Who won it? I mean, who were the other guys? Was anybody else swimming in that pool? And they covered him all the way. You literally could not find out who won it. The Winter Olympics in '84. I noticed as the GDR kept winning more medals, the age at which their athletes began training got younger and younger. They won a few medals, and the announcer said, "Well, in East Germany, the athletes, I hear the kids, they begin training at 11 and 12 years old. Then they won a few more medals by day 3. They were saying, and I hear they begin training at as young as 7 and 8. And by the end, they won a few more medals, and they said, well, in the GDR, they begin training as young as 4 and 5. And there was a cut shot of these little toddlers on the ice skates with their parents. And I say, my God, those commies are just ruthless what they do to their children. Super-patriotic morality is an inversion of individual morality. For the super-patriot, the nation-state is something more than an instrumental value. It's something more than a way of organizing order and law and whatever else to carry out other good things in life. It's not merely an instrumental value, it becomes an end value in itself. Those other things are no longer the end, they become instruments to serve this end. The state is no longer there to serve us, we are here to serve and glorify the state. The state becomes an entity of force unto itself, a powerfully abstracted symbol that claims our ultimate and total loyalty. A moral object, a moral entity in itself whose existence and growth are taken as self-justifying. You know, a question could be raised. What's so important about the state existing and growing and continuing and expanding and flourishing, whatever else? That's taken as self-justifying. In fact, that question would be considered unpatriotic. The moral code that applies to nationalism does not operate the same as the moral code that applies to individuals. The premises that governs all individual morality is that your behavior must at some point lead to self-restraint and even self-sacrifice. In individual morality, there are certain things you should not do, even if they're convenient, advantageous, and whatever else. Even if you have the impulse for them, even if they advance your self-interest, you must not do them. That's what the whole essence or code of individual morality is, as in thou shalt not. These premises are inverted when applied to a nation's behavior, and they often lead to terrible and untrammeled excesses. Individual morality is predicated on the notion that sin, that is harmful and unjust behavior, that's what I mean by sin. There is such a thing as sin, harmful and unjust behavior. That sin is always within the human potential. To err is human, to sin is all too human. But the nation state is something more than human, and there lies the power of its appeal. At the heart of the super-patriotic ethic is the belief that the nation's existence and its actions are so endowed with virtue as to place it above the commonplace rules of life. The restraints that apply to ordinary humans don't restrain the nation. So convinced of its supreme virtue, the nation knows no other restraint than the limitations of its own self-interest, its own desires, and the limitations of its own power. So ultimately, the restraint on a nation is the limitation of its power and the power of others. Ladies and gentlemen, the difference between individual morality and national morality is a very real one. When the aggrandizing individual commits an evil or harmful act, there's some sense that he is to be punished, he or she, or should be punished. At least some questions raised about whether proper standards of conduct haven't been violated. But some of the most outrageous acts, which would be outrageous under an individual moral code and unsupportable in civil life, are applauded as heroism when performed in the name of the nation. Thou shalt not becomes thou shalt do anything by any means necessary if it can be said to be in the national interest and if it serves national security. Well, who are the super-patriots? They can be found in high and low places. They can be found in the White House, and they can be found in your local American Legion post. But super-patriotism, I would argue, is not a product of mass psychology. It's not a product of mass macho psychology as such, although it certainly appeals to machismo, often resorting to a kind of John Wayne approach to foreign policy. I'll give you one quote. President Lyndon Johnson: "The U.S. will not act the great giant that is having its hands tied to get pushed around by a little dwarf armed with a penknife." That's Ronald Reagan. Same guys. That's Lyndon Johnson talking. The little dwarf with the penknife was Vietnam. We've been taught to think that the Archie Bunker is the prototype of the super-patriot. In fact, Archie is one of its victims, one of super-patriotism's victims. He's one of its consumers. He pays the taxes, he bleeds, he sends his kids off and all that, and he falls for it. The suppliers, the pushers of super-patriotism, most conspicuously are our top political leaders, our publicists, our media pundits, our institutional heads, including some college presidents and corporation leaders. Super-patriotic ideology is assiduously propagated by the ruling class of this society. That is the essence, that has been the essence of the Reagan propaganda effort over these 8 years. Like the anti-communist ideology, which is just the other side of that same coin, it is not a product of mass hysteria, although its goal often is to instigate mass hysteria. But ideas do not float around in social space. You see, there's no such thing as just an idea around like a virus. In fact, viruses don't quite float around. They go according to certain social relations. And so with ideas are mediated through social structure, through social organization, through a social system. That is, through organized status roles, groups, families, schools, communities, media, other institutions, whatever else. And some ideas then are mass marketed. Some ideas are taught to us from day one in those little flag salutes we have at school. But Ronald Reagan isn't just getting off in irrelevant things when he talks about flag salutes and prayers in the schools and pushing those symbols in school. He wants to institutionalize, he wants to internalize within kids at the first grade level, if you will, This gut instinct to wave that flag, to rally around that flag, to get in there when it's the Pueblo or the Grenada or Central America or whatever else, and not ask too many questions and just say, my country, and I love my country, and let's do it. I think it's not a manifestation of individual psychology. I think it's a mediated thing, because the super-patriotism, machoism, is not something that just swaggers around in any direction. It's directed toward very particular, specific political goals. It has very specific targets, like Cuba, Vietnam, Nicaragua, the USSR, Grenada, countries that are, or in case of Grenada, were developing social orders that threatened global capitalism. But in relation to some other countries, the super-patriots aren't so macho. In fact, they're very passive, very suffering, very accommodating, very supportive. They don't have the macho virtues that what the patriarchs would call the feminine virtues almost. They're this way when it comes to Chile, Guatemala, El Salvador, Indonesia, South Africa, Israel, South Korea, Zaire. Countries that support the interests of multinational capitalism and imperialism. So psychological categories in politics offer some explanation regarding predispositions, but they do not explain the actual policy directions. For that, you have to look at such things as class interests, economic interests, and other such things. One of the key functions of super-patriotism is to blur the differences in class interests in our society and try to convince us that we're all in the same boat, rich and poor alike, you, me, the Mellons, the Morgans, the Rockefellers. We are made to believe that the people of the United States have a community of interest with the giant multinationals. The very companies that at any time might export our jobs and abandon and desert our communities in that very unpatriotic way, as I said before. In truth, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, on almost every issue, we the people are not in the same boat with the big financiers and companies. The costs of our policies are not equally shared. We pay the brunt of the costs. The benefits of our policies are not equally enjoyed. We don't get much of that. I give you the case of the Persian Gulf, where it's costing us $2.50 for every dollar's worth of oil that's coming out of the Persian Gulf. That's not so irrational, because we're paying the $2.50 and the oil companies are making the dollar. Even if it's not coming to the U.S., only 4% of that comes to the U.S. The Seven Sisters, the oil companies, the big oil cartels don't care if they sell it in the U.S. or in Japan, France, which is where it's really going. And we're not protecting the oil supply for Japan or France. We are protecting the oil supply of those companies. So there's a case of policy not being shared equally. There's a case where you have to have a class analysis rather than a flag-waving analysis. This is true, by the way, this is equally true of ancient empires as well as modern empires. In 1919, the conservative economists, very prominent economist, a very creative one too, Joseph Schumpeter, he described the imperialism of classical Rome in words that might sound familiar to present-day Americans. Quote, "That policy which pretends to aspire to peace but unerringly generates war. The policy of continual preparation for war. The policy of meddlesome interventionism." He's writing in 1919 about ancient Rome. "There was no corner of the known world where some interest was not alleged to be in danger or under attack. If the interests were not Roman, they were those of Rome's allies. And if Rome had no allies, then allies would be invented. When it was utterly impossible to contrive such an interest, why, then it was the national honor that had been insulted. The fight was always invested with an aura of legality. Rome was always being attacked by evil-minded neighbors, always fighting for a breathing space. The whole world was pervaded by a host of enemies, and it was manifestly Rome's duty to guard against their indubitably aggressive designs. They were enemies who only waited to fall upon the Roman people. Such a policy can be understood," Schumpeter continues, "only by ascertaining what, quote, domestic class interests benefited from it." Even, you see, conservatives can have a class analysis as long as it's 2,000 years ago. They won't do it here. What domestic class interests benefited from the growth, the ruthlessness, the power of the Roman Empire? Schumpeter goes on, he says, "Those who gained were the aristocracy of landlords, agricultural entrepreneurs, born of struggle against their own people, whose dominance rested that is the entrepreneurs and landlords, their dominance rested on control of the state machine. The historian Ernst Badian, also talking about Rome, no administration in history has ever devoted itself so wholeheartedly to fleecing its subjects for the private benefit of its ruling class as Rome of the last age of the Republic. And he too was writing before the Reagan administration came into office.
You are listening to author and political analyst Michael Parenti on superpatriotism and the importance of being number one. At the end of the program, there will be information on how to obtain a copy of this talk.
Now, seeing the hypocrisy and evil that's done under the name of patriotism, there were many on the left, especially during the Vietnam era, who began attacking the symbols of patriotism, who began attacking the symbols of our country. They put blame on everything on an entity called America, and they even spelt America with 3 Ks. They burned American flags, thereby convincing millions of our compatriots that they were traitors, or nuts in any case. They blamed America for what was being done in its name by a coterie of imperialists and militarists and capitalists. And these imperialists and militarists and capitalists, in turn, legitimated their own crimes by wrapping themselves around this same flag. They were a lot smarter. While we in the New Left were burning flags, I never burned a flag, but I mean, our guys were burning flags. They were wrapping themselves around in the flag. And they could conveniently brand then all opposition to their policies as attacks against America. Not criticism of Nixon, not attacks of Nixon's policies, but attacks against America. It was giving them then a remarkable psychological advantage. It became very easy for ruling class representatives like Richard Nixon in that day, and today people like Gene Kirkpatrick and Ronald Reagan, to brand the protesters as part of that, quote, hate America crowd. I think perhaps the anarchist tendencies in the New Left added fuel to this super-patriotic bonfire. Anarchists see the state as the enemy, rather than the particular policies and particular class interests of particular states. In a sense, I would argue, I don't want to push this too much, but that they're a mirror image of the super-patriots. They elevate the state to a disembodied entity, one that's supremely evil. The super-patriot elevates it to an entity that's supremely virtuous. That is an end of itself and a moral existence of its own. And so they attack the symbols of the state, and they play right into the hands of leaders who have always sought, who always seek to equate ruling class interests with the state itself, who always seek to equate their particular class interests with the general interests, who always seek to equate their policies, their ventures with the needs of the American people. Leaders who equate their rotten, unjust policies with the good name of our nation. Now, in contrast to the super-patriots, it begins to brighten here. In contrast to the super-patriots are the real patriots. We who, for instance, don't want to see the good name of our nation sullied. Real patriots love their country enough to want to improve it, and their patriotism has a social content, and that social content is social justice. Real patriots do things the American way, the democratic way, not with secret crypto-fascist coteries in the national security state, but with open debate and open challenges against privileged interests. Real patriots know that democracy is not just the ability to hold elections, but to serve and fulfill the basic needs and interests of the demos, the people. Real patriots are also internationalists. They may love and feel attached to their country, but they also love the peoples of all countries, all being different representations of the human family. Real patriots educate themselves about the real history of their country, and they're not satisfied with the flag-waving promo stuff. They want a people's history as written by people like Philip Foner, Eric Foner, Boyers and Moraes, Herbert Aptheker, and Howard Zinn. Real patriots find different things in our history to be proud of than the super-patriots do. We're proud of things like the struggle for the enfranchisement, the abolitionist movement, the peace movement, the abolition of child labor, the struggle for collective bargaining, the extension of universal suffrage to people of color and to women, the struggle for racial justice, the 8-hour day, occupational safety, the struggle for gender equality. In the Real Patriots pantheon can be found Tom Paine, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Mark Twain, Susan B. Anthony, Big Bill Haywood, John Reed, Eugene Victor Debs, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, William Z. Foster, A.J. Musty, Harry Bridges, Martin Luther King, and Senator Garland. And And not just those notables, but the thousands and the tens of thousands and the millions of people in the ranks who fought all those struggles, who raised up those leaders, who brought up those leaders, brought them forth and made them national and political realities. And if we are super patriots, ladies and gentlemen, I think what we finally have to do now is we got to be more selfish. We can't be like the super patriots. They're selfless. They want to die, they want to kill, they want to die for their country, they want to kill people for their country, they want to die for their country. And they're selfless because they never worry about the quality of our life. They're always concerned about the Cubans, the Chinese, and the Russians. Are they free? Are they getting both sides of the story? What's the quality of their life there? Be a little more selfish. Think about our own life. Think about us. There's a lot of people in this country that think things have got to change, and they got to change in a fundamental way. But our leaders don't talk about that, and our media don't talk about that. We need change. We need to tax the rich and not the poor. We need to restructure the use of energy to save the environment and ourselves. We need less hogwash about affirmative action. Because all this publicity given to affirmative action has convinced all sorts of people that women and people of color are looking for special treatment. Always be suspicious of an issue when the media gives it a lot of attention. Because we know that affirmative action isn't the problem. The truth is, the real problem in this country is the persistent and virulent racism and sexism in training, recruitment, hiring, job evaluation, wages, salaries, and personal relations. And that's the struggle for equality. It's not for some special treatment. We need a health insurance program for the 35 million Americans who are not covered. I mean, isn't that amazing? Isn't it time for an investigation? How could that be? How did that come about? Why? We need people who not only bemoan these things, like the liberals say, isn't it a shame, the homeless? Isn't it a shame, not enough adequate health care? Isn't it a shame? You have to stop complaining about that. You have to start asking, but why does that exist? What are the forces that allow in the richest country in the world these kinds of terrible inhumanities and inequalities? And not just national health insurance, we need a national health program for everyone. We need some relief from the evasive, fatuous, mealy-mouthed, know-it-all anti-communist media pundits and conservative columnists, the gas bags who sit there. You see them now with elections? Here's some candidates who are trying to talk about the issues, most notably Jesse Jackson. And what do these guys do? They have become theater critics. The show is over and they say, well, Bob, what do you think? Well, I thought his delivery was very good. He seemed calm. He had a good rapport with the audience, and he used that one thing very effectively. Yes, he did. He ran into a little trouble. On the other hand, Senator Zollin seemed not quite had it together today. He seemed like he probably tired because he's been on the road so long. Yes, I think that's what it was. And I'm sitting there and I'm saying, what the hell have I got to hear this for? What is this theater critic stuff? They don't talk about the issue. They talk about process. In fact, they talk about talking about process. The airwaves of this country, ladies and gentlemen, are the property of the people of the United States. That may come as a surprise to some network bosses, but it's true. And those airwaves should be opened up. There should be public access television. We need exposure to a socialist perspective. We need exposure to various dissident perspectives in the mainstream media. Not just, as I say, ideas are mediated through a social structure, and some of them get the mass market, and some of them are left for very small and select audiences. And we need discussion of worker-controlled enterprises and public ownership. We need a national debate in the mainstream media on the oppressive, unjust purposes of U.S. foreign policy in the Third World and elsewhere. We need to re-examine our institutions, our schools, our colleges, hospitals, museums. We've got to find out why all those institutions, our media, why they are all dominated by self-selected boards of trustees or regents who are answerable to no one but themselves and who control all spending, all hiring, and all other policies. We need a government that has the capacity to go directly into not-for-profit production. If private industry can't provide the needs of the people, if the utilities can't give you electricity without jacking up the rates every year, jacking it up again and again, then take it away from the utilities and the people themselves can do it themselves. If private industry can't build us homes and hospitals and get jobs, then let the public sector do it. There's all these people who need work. There's all this work that needs to be done. There's all this capital that can be used to do it, and none of it's come together because there's no profits in it for the Morgans and the Rockefellers. and the DuPonts. So then let the public sector do it, not for profit, and it will get done. And when it gets done, it creates social income, it creates private income, it expands your tax base, it creates public income, and it creates more opportunities for growth. The danger with that, the danger is not that it won't work, the danger is that it does work. And that's why they stop it, that's why they want privatization, that's why they sell off Conrail at 1/3 its actual value, because Conrail under public ownership was working, and those railroads under private ownership were milked like cows, milked and run down, and then they turn around to the government, they turn around to the taxpayer, and then they go socialist after they've milked it down and it's about to fall apart, and they say, we can't run it anymore, you're going to have to take it over. And the taxpayers take it over, and they dig deeper into their pockets, and they pay for it, and they put it back on a working basis, a rational basis, a not-for-profit basis, so that the money it makes goes back into it and doesn't go out to the George Bushes and the Ronald Reagans and their class. And then when it works, Ronald Reagan says, we got to sell this thing. And he sells it not because it wasn't working, but because it does work. We need to open up our political system, ladies and gentlemen. We need to have new parties, not just two capitalist parties, not just two anti-communist parties, not just one party that red baits and liberal baits, and another party that lives in fear of being red baited and liberal baited. We need to do what the Sandinistas in Nicaragua have done, which is have proportional representation, so that if a minority party wins 11% of the vote in Nicaragua, it gets 11% of the seats in the National Assembly. They don't tell you that in the media. Ronald Reagan hasn't dwelled on that fact, has he? As the Sandinistas have done, we need funding for minority parties. We need free TV time for minority parties. Conservatives palm themselves off as being more patriotic than liberals. Liberals think they're more patriotic than socialists and others on the left. But we on the left are second to no one in our patriotism. We want perestroika, we want fundamental restructuring and democratization of overseas and domestic policies. We want a restructuring and democratization of the political process, the values, institutions, the economy, and the class power of this country. We real patriots say, along with Albert Camus, I want to love my country and justice too. And in fact, I believe that the only way you can be a real patriot is to love justice. Because you can't be patriotic to something that's unjust. We want to spend less time trying to save the world with bombers and battleships and more time healing ourselves. This is not just a good idea or a noble pronouncement. It is a historical necessity. This country does not belong to Ronald Reagan and his billionaire friends, although they act like it does. It belongs to us, and sooner or later we will take it back. Thank you.
I want to go back for clarification to something you whizzed through real quickly in your talk about the psychological roots or lack of psychological roots for the need to be number one. The word machismo went by real fast, and it seemed that you were saying that the need to be number one doesn't come out of some inner psychological need. It comes out of the ruling class's manipulation of media and education. Is that true?
Yes, in a way, not the need. We may have all sorts of needs, and the question is then, how are those needs channelized? They could be channelized into creative forms of competition, which community is going to build the cleaner community, nicer, safer community. You could do it that way. Or it could be channelized into who's going to be tougher, what team is going to win, we're number one. I don't believe that we're possessed by demons. And much of psychoanalysis, much of psychology really postulates that there is in us these demons. They don't call them demons, they call them impulses, needs, complexes, hang-ups, problems, this and that. I don't think we just got that. It's very 14th century. They used to burn people who had those problems in those days. Now we go around and we make the shrinks rich. That's the difference. I think that a lot of that gets manufactured into society. I don't believe necessarily that people wanted to rampage through a street and break windows and beat their horns and yell, yay, because their football team beat the other city's football team. I think that's learned behavior. I think they learned that because that's all their culture gives them. And if you treat the people like a citizenry, as in Athens, where common citizens started to study rhetoric so they could get up in the assembly and speak, then you'll have citizens. And if you treat the people like a rabble, as they did in Rome, screeching, get their heads off, and go to the bread and circuses and don't have a thing on mind, and hail the emperor, hail Caesar, then you'll have a rabble. If you build and you organize your society to produce a rabble, you get a rabble, and if you organize a citizenry, you get a citizenry. So I think it's reductionist to say this is just an outgrowth of our machismo, you see. The thing, number one, the ordinary macho guy isn't really clamoring for America to be number one, but that's what he keeps hearing. He hears his president say it. He hears that that's the thing you got to be. He links that up to his own security and his own well-being. He hears that America is threatened by all sorts of people out there, and the only way he'll survive and his nation and his family, his community is going to survive is if we take care of the Russian bear or Gaddafi or the Grenadan menace or whatever. The next day it could be something else, the Sandinistas in Central America. So those are things and cues that are being fed. So what I said is the machismo may be a predispositional set, but it doesn't explain the directions of the policy. Is that clear?
How do you explain the occurrence of war in human history?
Well, that's a big question. The occurrence of war in human history. Well, there are plenty of macho people in Switzerland. How do you explain that the most male chauvinist society doesn't have wars? I mean, you go to Switzerland, there's as many neurotics and machismo people and all sorts of other people. Personality distributions maybe is roughly the same as in any other opinion, but they don't have wars, and they don't have wars in Sweden. So I think there are larger social conditions and interests that explain wars. I do not believe that war is something that just springs from the breast of man, and you don't mean people, you mean man in this case. If men just wanted wars, how do you explain the draft? Why must they be drafted under penalty of 5 years in prison? Why do they go into exile? Why do they try to get 4 Fs? If they just want to go fight and kill. There are those particular kinds of personalities. And during Vietnam, they found a very good place. The Navy pilot who said, I love to hit a virgin building in Vietnam. I really get off on it when I bring my plane down. That tells us something about that Navy pilot that doesn't explain the Vietnam War. Because you could bomb in Mexico, you could bomb in Indonesia, you could bomb in Paraguay, you could bomb in South Africa, you could bomb any number of other countries. Why were you bombing in Vietnam? What's that all about? It doesn't explain why if these guys got to go to war. Even Joseph Goebbels said that. He said, nobody wants to go to war, not even a German. Not even a German. He said, no poor Slav wants to go sit in a freezing trench and have the stink and smell of blood and death and hear the screams of his buddies wounded and lie there with the stink of fear in every pore of his body that he might be killed in the next minute. Nobody wants that, to be torn away from your home, your career, your family. To be sitting in a freezing trench, you'd rather be home in a nice warm bed with your honey. Obviously, none of them want that. You've got to wave a flag in their face, and you've got to convince them that their country is threatened and all that sort of thing. And even that doesn't get it. You finally have to use the coercive power of the state. You've got to draft them. And you've got to say, you go in the army, or you go to prison, or you get shot. Those are your alternatives. So if it was so much in human beings to just want to fight and kill, why must they go through those kind of things? Therefore, I think you have to look at war as something which is the product of social organization. War is not an expression of an individual predisposition. War is the product of a particular and a very elaborate and very technical and complex social organization, and that's what you would have to look at. This idea of just looking at trying to explain social things by something in the individual bosom is, I think, bad sociology. It's bad social science. What you've left out is a whole bunch of intermediary things like social structure, the economy, the class interests of certain people, the culture, and all those other things. I'm sorry, you got to come up to the microphone and I'll be happy to hear you. Or say it louder again. Why? Well, only men don't make wars. Women have been so oppressed in the world that they have not had the opportunities to be in positions of power. And when they have been in positions of power, they make wars. Indira Gandhi made wars. Golda Meir made wars. Margaret Thatcher made wars. She sent men off to die and kill, and she was like any other politician. Oh, that's because they're male. They're operating in a male thing. Okay. They're operating in a macho male psychology. So then it's not what's between your legs that counts, it's what's between your brains. It's the psychology that you're in. That's exactly it. And you've demonstrated my point, that even women, when they are put in that psychology and in that social system, and they're interested in things like power and re-election and territory and economic gain, even women will act like men. And the reason women haven't been doing that through history is because they have been denied access to power. Yes?
I feel the lack of a gender relations analysis in your analysis, and so I'm going to bring it up again, as the other women have. One way in which I thought about it while you were talking was that there was no acknowledgement that this super patriot or number one mentality benefits men in some ways and hurts women in some other ways, in very serious ways, and I'd like you to respond to that.
Well, you know, it's less and less a purely male domain. I mean, one of the ironic things is that as feminism won certain victories, like the ability to be in the army, they also then share in the not-so-nice things. As women win mobility and access to the society, they begin to share in the sins of that society. So you do have women's units now in the Marines, in the Air Force, in the Navy, and in the infantry and the Army. Although I guess the Army now just has a new policy that women are not going to go into combat. Isn't that the latest rule now? I think they just recently decided that women can get the training, but they will not go into combat. But it still is predominantly a male domain, and it preaches virtues that have traditionally been associated with men. However, my impression is that women are in the Army to prove that those virtues are not exclusively men, that they too can do a 10-mile hike, that they can climb that rope and go over that wooden wall, and they can get through basic training. So super patriotism is now expanding its clientele. It's recruiting women into its ranks also. It victimizes women in the way that I think any conservative thought victimizes women. It victimizes women as workers. It victimizes women as women. I mentioned personal relations. It victimizes women as plaintiffs in law, where the crimes against women are not treated as seriously as they should be. And those crimes are terrible. The condition of women in this world is terrible. I mean, women are being beaten, they're being raped, they're being exploited, they're being used in prostitution. Read Kathleen Barry's book, Female Sexual Slavery. She points out that most prostitution is not voluntary. It is not voluntary. Most prostitution, almost all of it. Maybe there's the college girl on the east side who, goes to the posh apartment and works with a nice madam and gets some quick money get herself through graduate school. That's not the other 90% of the prostitutes throughout the world. She gives the case of the Mayo tribesmen who are recruited by the CIA to carry out counter-revolution, and the CIA flies in these prostitutes. And she says, why are you calling them prostitutes? Prostitutes implies voluntary employment. These are girls taken from, young women taken from remote villages. Would they volunteer to go to some place they don't even know among these men and to be used sexually in this way? They really are sexual slaves. The areas where female infibulation is used, the ways women are abused in marriages and battered wives, these are terrible things, and these are all part of a very real and very terrible oppression. I'm sorry my talk wasn't about that subject. It's a real subject, and my talk wasn't about it. I don't deny that super patriotism has this macho thing. What I was trying to say, and I don't know why you would balk at that, is that macho thing isn't the cause of imperialism. That imperialism really is carried out by people who have very rational goals and rational gains, and they make a lot of money out of it. They make a lot out of their multi-billion-dollar world investments. And imperialism is a way of maintaining global capitalism, and it's a way of maintaining that class privilege.